12 o'clock midday webinar. Delighted today to be joined by Jonathan Booth as our guest speaker, talking about effective partnership working, but more of that later. Very, very good afternoon to you. We'll be starting in just a minute or so. We're just giving people time to come in. As we always say, I think people tend to skip straight out of one Teams meeting into a Zoom meeting and then on to something else. So we like to give people a bit of an opportunity to join us. We're expecting about a couple of dozen today, so not huge in quantity, but looking at those signed in, very much high in quality, which of course is what matters. So you're very welcome. Thank you for joining us. We'll just give it another 60 seconds and then we'll kick off. So don't forget, as always, if you just put your name and your organization and where you're tuning in from geographically in the chat box, that would be really useful so that Jonathan knows who he's speaking to. So your name, your organization, and where you are geographically in the UK is always good to know. So just pop that in the chat box if you would be so very kind. We'll give you a bit of a shout out. Acts as a bit of a networking tool as well at the same time. So if you want to put your contact details and so on, so others can see who you are, what you do, I think that would be very helpful. And as my colleagues at Leaders Meets have also just acknowledged, there is a Slido opening survey which you can start using. You can see the details on the screen. Also, there's a QR code you can scan in, or of course you can go to slido.com and the details are there for you. So we've had our first hello from Robin Thorpe of Thorpe Engineering Consultants on the South Coast in Bournemouth, and also chair of CE Dorset. Yes, Robin, doing a grand job for us all down there. I'm not sure what the weather's like down on the South Coast, but here in Somerset, it's turned a bit dull, unfortunately. But there we are. Anyway, I think at 2 minutes past, we ought to say we'll kick off. Oh, hello, Linda. Hello, Linda from Durham at the other end of the country. Oh, and Jim Prescott's in, All Sports Coaching Academy based in Telford. So there we are. We've already got a good mix geographically, which is superb to know. So very, very warm welcome to you this afternoon. My name's Andrew Carpenter. I am Chief Executive of the Structural Timber Association and also Chief Executive of Constructing Excellence in the Southwest and the Midlands. And these webinars kicked off back in March last year. We've been going well over a year now with these 12 o'clock sessions and obviously proving very useful and very valuable, which is great to see. I'm now joined in hosting it with all my colleagues from around the UK from a CE perspective and also the CIOB in the Southwest. So that's brilliant. And we cover all sorts of topics, as you know, for the regular frequenters of this webinar service. Before I introduce Jonathan, I'm going to hand over now to Howard, who will just go through the house rules. But before Howard, I do that, two more hellos. Jill Marlowe, Estates Property Manager from Nottingham Trent University, and Alex Robb from Atkins in Swansea. So already we're seeing an audience from around the UK, which is great to see. Howard, over to you.
Thanks, Andrew. Good afternoon to everyone. For those of you who are regular attenders, you know that we use Slido, but for those who are not, you can get into Slido. Most people do it on their phone. You can use the QR reader. It's not specific to Slido, so any QR reader will take you straight there. Or you can go to slido.com and enter today's code, which is LM180621. Some of you had already started to take the poll. We'll come to that in a minute. We're going to be using Slido for questions. So if you have any questions for Jonathan, please do type them into Slido, into the Q&A. If you think it's a good question or it's a similar question to one you would ask, you can vote for it. That will put that question up to the top of the questions list. And at the end, we'll be posting a poll for feedback. We'd appreciate your feedback. It's the way that we can learn and change and improve things for the future. So Abraham, let's put the poll up so we can quickly run through it. The way we're going to run the poll today is simply two questions, but they have some selections you have to make. So let's put the first question up. What makes a successful partnership? So you have a number of different things you can choose from. Please choose up to 4. Now, how we're going to run the poll today is during Jonathan's presentation, we will come back to the poll results. So I'd ask if you could please try and do it now, but if not, you've probably got 2 or 3 minutes following to complete the poll. And the more of us do it, the more we get an understanding of what the knowledge and what the views in the room are. So thanks very much. So the second question, again, please do 4 choices. We're up to 6. Be nice to see if we've got 18 in the room at the moment. Be nice to see if we could get 10 or 12, get 2/3 of the view of the room. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hand back to Andrew now. So please carry on completing the poll. And thanks very much. And probably see you later on. Over to you, Andrew.
Thank you, Howard. So before I introduce Jonathan, there can be no doubt that the raison d'etre for Constructing Excellence and its predecessors, Construction Best Practice Program, Movement for Innovation, and so on, when we kicked off post the Egan Report in 1998, our raison d'etre was partnering. That was the buzzword of the time, and since then it's been called all sorts of different things. I think probably the common terminology is collaborative working, but we've been preaching the need for partnering for 23 years within the UK construction industry, or partnerships, as I say, many different words that are used to describe what we're going to talk about today. But I was talking to the speakers before we opened the doors, and I've facilitated workshops for 23 years on partnerships, and whatever the subject matter, whether it be sustainability, health and safety, staff retention, or whatever, once you've done the post-it note exercise around the room, the answer is always you need an integrated supply chain with a collaborative culture. So we've known what to do and why we should do it for 20 odd years, but I think what we're struggling with is the how. So I'm delighted to say that today we've got Jonathan with us, Jonathan Booth from Journey 4, who I think is going to give us some pearls of wisdom in terms of maybe how we might achieve what we've been striving to achieve for all that time. So Jonathan, I'm delighted that you've been able to give up some of your valuable time to be with us here this afternoon. Looking forward to what you have to say, and hopefully participating as the hour progresses. But right now, you'll be pleased to mute myself and stop the video, and I'm going to hand over to you. All yours, Jonathan.
Thanks very much, Andrew, and thank you for the kind introduction. And good afternoon, everybody. I'm just going to share my screen now, so I hope that you can all see that. Just want to get into slideshow. Is that okay, everybody? So, as Andrew says, I'm going to talk about effective partnership working, and my plan for today is not to necessarily do a lot of the theory, give you a bit of theory, but really to talk about examples of partnerships I've worked in over the last 30 years, some good, some bad, some less so, and share some examples and some tips about how partnerships can work more effectively. So just to give you a bit of background on me before we get started, I wouldn't describe myself as a partnership expert, but I have a lot of expertise and experience of working in partnerships. So as you'll see there on the left, over 30 years, I've worked in a number of partnerships, in fact, on and in a number of partnerships. There's a couple of those partnerships I worked in, and in one I led many years ago. Others I worked on as a consultant. And as you'll see on the right there, I am a management consultant. I founded Journey 4 in 2002, just heading into our 20th year. And we're a customer-driven growth and transformation specialist, working primarily in those sectors you can see there. And in those sectors, a lot of our work has been with clients who are either joint ventures formally, or who are delivering services in partnership, either contractually or otherwise. So of those experiences that I've had, I just wanted to pick out a couple just to give you some ideas of roles I've played and how I've got my experience from those partnerships. And the first one I was involved in was back in the 1990s with Atkins and Parkman, and I was working for Atkins. And I was responsible for this was a partnership designed to as part of the bid for Manchester to host the Olympics, which obviously it lost to Sydney for the 2000 Olympics. And that partnership actually involved in creating the physical transport access to the sites in East Manchester, which is now where the Manchester City Etihad Stadium exists, and the whole development of that east side of Manchester area, which was a partnership, was was successful. Obviously, the bid wasn't successful. The partnership was very successful. And that was my first taste of being thrown in the deep end on a very tight timescale to get a business to work together. And over the years, I led a partnership on behalf of M. Brown with Links Carriers, which was a mail order particular venture, which I'll talk about a bit in a while. And more latterly, I've worked as a consultant on partnerships with Serco and Abellio in rail, and which I'm still working on, and with Royal Mail and Balfour Beatty in facilities management, and with Severn Trent and Amy in utilities, particularly in water. So I will come back to some of those examples, but I won't name them, although you may be able to guess from the examples I give which of those they are. But I'll try not to obviously give too much away about individual projects, but I'll try to give you a flavour of the experiences. So as I said, there's a bit of theory, but my main activity today is to try and give you some examples of partnerships, how they work well, what to avoid in terms of particular pitfalls, and then I'd like to spend a bit of time on particularly on supply chain partnerships towards the end, as I think they're quite relevant to this sector. So in terms of partnerships, my view of partnerships, and Andrew mentioned the word collaboration already, the words become trendy over time. There's a big move towards alliances in the water sector not so long ago. That's now petered out. So I think whatever we call a partnership, whether it's a formal construction partnership, an informal collaboration, be it an alliance, an association, a joint venture, which can be obviously a formal move by parties to come together. I think all those things really, that what we're talking about here is the principles of partnership. The same principles apply, and those principles apply to how partnerships should be formed and should be delivered, and then should be progressed to become truly effective. And what's interesting, I think, at the moment is that whilst phrases come and go in vogue, ultimately businesses collaborating or partnering to deliver something they can't do on their own is always of value. We work with our own business with several partners. Just in fact in the process of constructing a joint venture with one of those partners. And when you get it right, it's really powerful. I noticed just last week that Harvard Business Review has just done some analysis into the trends around partnering, and it came up with the analysis that in times of downturn, and particularly where we may be now in the hopefully post-COVID period of starting to accelerate into recovery, that's when partnerships are at their height. So potentially now is a very good time to talk and think about partnerships, as there are opportunities to, as you accelerate into recovery, to get scale of growth and new opportunities you can't get through organic growth as quickly. And that's the prime reason why people tend to look to partner this time in a sort of economic cycle. It offers real value in terms of being able to make a step change, either accessing broader markets or offering additional services that you can't offer on your own. So that's just the background to it, but I really want to talk about my experiences now to give you some flavour and hopefully to pick out some things that will give you some insight into good and bad practice. So I couldn't obviously help but use my hero Clint Eastwood to articulate this view of the good, the bad and the ugly. And I want to give you examples of each of those, starting with the ugly. So I mentioned one partnership I worked in earlier where, in theory, there was a partnership between two fairly large organisations that offered them a chance to exploit a market they weren't currently in. And this was a new market opportunity that was probably ahead of its time. The chief execs of those two businesses were both very big characters in this industry, and they went to market and went to the city, both were listed, and told everybody about their partnership. And there was a big hurrah about this partnership. And they came back to the office, and then both of those businesses decided they've got to put somebody in place to run this partnership. I was put in place from one organisation and had an opposite number from another organisation. And that person is still a very good friend of mine. And our friendship was formed out of a failing partnership, because that partnership was doomed to failure from day one. There was very little investment in anything other than the idea. The big idea, there was a bit of money, a team put together, and we quickly worked out this model wasn't going to work. But of course, our leaders had promised that to the city, and they carried on with the message, they carried on with the commitment that it would work, but didn't listen to the people involved in the business. And we spent a year proving why it wouldn't work, how it wouldn't work. In the end, that caused a loss of share price, significantly in one party's point. It certainly caused a loss of income, and it resulted in the two parties falling out and having having legal spats. So very ugly, did take some time to unravel afterwards. And it wasn't that the partnership was necessarily badly formed, it was more the way it went about it, and the fact that the leaders at the top of the organisation didn't want to really understand what was involved. They just wanted to come up with the answer and hear that it was successful. On the bad side, I've worked in a couple of partnerships, or on a couple of partnerships as a consultant in this space, where businesses have come together to offer a service where one may be, in one case, a client, the other one a supplier. In the other example, two suppliers coming together to offer a broader service. And in both these cases, the partnerships weren't badly formed necessarily, and the upfront work, the idea, wasn't badly conceived. What failed was their ability or lack of ability to follow through. So a lot of the principle was sound. In practice, they never really got to grips with the reality of what was required, didn't change the way they were going to operate together, operate as two businesses in partnership, talked a good story, but when it came down to the leaders actually demonstrating the way to behave particularly, that didn't follow through. And as a consequence, you had silo working within the two parties, you had a them and us mentality, and you had partners that on the face of it said one thing and did something else. And of course, for the people involved in the partnership, the minute you get that failure on integrity, you get that difference, that the sort of say-do gap, as we call it, between what they say and what they do, it undermines the confidence and trust of everybody working in that partnership. That partnership, one of those partnerships, secured a 23-year contract. That partnership was dysfunctional within 2 years, never really got to grips with the behaviours in the early days. And whilst on the surface of it, the contract has continued, it hasn't been able to succeed to the degree it could do. And what's happened over that 20-year period, and it's like 18 years into it now, is that the partners have taken it in turns to drive it, if you like, with the other partner being a passenger and dragged along. So whilst they've delivered a service, they haven't really delivered the service to the degree it could be. They've had lots of penalties. One of those cases, they actually lost the contract. But on the good side, there are obviously good stories. And I'm very keen here not to talk about just the downside and the bad stories. There's a contract that I worked on, which was two businesses that actually were in a failing partnership. They had £1 billion contract that they were at risk of losing. And the MD of one of those contracts is a client I'd had previously who asked me to come and do some work with them. And basically what they realized was they weren't delivering the service that their customers required. Their customers were giving them fairly clear feedback. This was a national contract, national footprint, big contract, lots of people working on it from both parties, and they weren't delivering. They were delivering a reactive service, and the client wanted a more proactive service. And without giving too much away, this was a contract in which, to give you an example, they were doing a lot of facilities management work, and one part of that was maintenance of lifts across a massive estate. And their approach was, they had an SLA, contractual SLA. Their approach was to arrive and visit a lift within 4 hours of it failing. That was the SLA. And they were very good at meeting that SLA. And they turned up, and they'd often turn up and put a piece of tape over the lift and say, yes, it's broken. And of course, for the client, they were none the better. They still got a broken lift. They just now had a piece of tape and a safety cone in front of it. And what the client wanted was them to change their approach and say, well, if you service these lists and you've got all the data, can you help us prevent the lifts from breaking in the first place? And that simple story transformed the whole partnership. We changed the whole model to a custom-focused model around how could we work to avoid downtime for the client, to stop them working, how can we keep them moving? And that became the vision or the purpose for the organization, to keep their client moving. And by doing that, within a very short period of time, they turned the contract around. They secured a £1 billion contract extension, and that contract then went on to deliver great service, and they followed that through over years. So good can be achieved, takes time and effort. It's not the principle of the idea of the partnership that's the challenge. It's making sure you really follow through, understand what you're trying to achieve, and commit to delivering it. So there's some examples of partnerships. The types of partnerships that I've experienced working on have been for different reasons. They've been very much driven by either a desire to deliver a service, where a service is being contracted out to a supply chain partner, which we'll talk about a bit later, or where two businesses together can offer a broader service to their customers are looking for, where they can win new market share or win new contracts, or where they can grow. And I think the key thing is here that, from my perspective anyway, whatever the different types and whatever the reasons for those partnerships being formed are, that there's common success factors at play. And those success factors are what we can hopefully learn from and replicate in partnerships we're involved in. So at that point, what I'd like to do is get the results of the first poll up. So if I'm going to stop sharing my screen briefly, and I think, Howard, you can share the results.
Yep. Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. Okay, Abraham, let's put the results up for the first question, if we could, please. Okay, so to remind people, we've got 12, so we've got 2/3. So those were the choices. So let's see what we actually got. Well, shared objectives seems to be an absolute winner, and I think a key thing about what you've just been talking about, Jonathan, clear vision, strategy, and some common values, and a strong mutual benefit. So I think everything you're saying so far, people are agreeing with.
That's great. That's really good to see. And as you'll see in a minute, I think we've got the top four there, the top four things that I would recommend. So if we can drop that screen down, I'll share my screen and we'll carry on. Thank you very much.
Okay. So
from a Journey Forward perspective, then these are the top four things we've identified through our work over the years. He says, apologies, my screen seems to have frozen. There we go. So just wanted to give you a couple of quotes first. And this is a quote on the left-hand side that was attributed to myself. And I don't often see my name in light, so I was quite, couldn't resist. This is a quote I'd written for a client, actually, about when a partnership can be effective and sustainable. And the point I made is that partners have got to be aligned. They've got to feel there's something to get out of it each. They've got to be similar aims, similar value, and fully committed to actually not just forming it and seeing it through. And you'll see from the quote on the right there, attributed to Henry Ford, the coming together bit is easy. That's the beginning. Keeping it together is obviously his progress, as he says, but the key is working together. That's the success. It's the collaboration. Partnerships aren't easy. You have moments where it gets difficult, and those are moments in which you either make a success or a failure of the partnership. If you work at it and work through those difficulties and really embed how to work together collaboratively, which takes time, you will be successful. So coming back to those four drivers and the poll results, these are the four factors that we've highlighted. First of all, common purpose, which came out in the results we saw a minute ago. So that's making sure there's a real clear vision for what we're trying to achieve, but that's shared both at the level of the two businesses and at the partnership. Sometimes you can get within the partnership itself, people are very clear what they want to achieve, but the two hosting parties are not necessarily aligned. So a common purpose and clear vision is really critical. And these are all equal in my view. There's no sort of priority within this. Cultural fit is equally important. And if anything, I would say ultimately, this is the one that probably does just quite edge it in terms of importance. You can have people with the same ideas, the same drive. If they don't demonstrate the same behaviors, it becomes a real problem. I was just mentioning earlier about we're entering into a joint venture. We had two partners in line for this joint venture. On the surface of it, both had the same capability. One partner potentially had slightly more experience and slightly more reach than the other. But when it came down to cultural fit and particularly behaviors, the partner with the better reach and better experience didn't have the right behaviors. We went with the other partner because they had the right behaviors and because we were culturally on the same alignment. We both trusted each other. We were both open to what we wanted to achieve and willing to work on that together. And I can't stress enough the importance of that. And ultimately, as we know, it's all about those behaviors, whether people are prepared to pull their sleeves up, get in it together and make sure they're pulling in the same direction. And equally, I think alongside that is equal value for both parties. So if one party feels it's getting more out of it than the other, or putting more effort in than the other to get the same output, it will always be a problem. It'll be, obviously, in time it will change. Not everybody will be putting in the same input and output to get you the same results at the same time. But over an agreed period of time, if that equality isn't there, it will just gnaw away and it will eventually come out in frustration and worse. So I think there's a real need to make sure there's equality there, and mutual benefit. As you'll see at the bottom right there, we're part of a consultancy growth network, and there was a survey conducted only last month by the consultancy growth network, and 80% of their members identified this as the top measure in terms of the importance and key to having a successful partnership. That's not to underestimate the last point here, which is about a shared commitment to working on the partnership, not just in it. So once we've formed our partnership, we've established we've got a good cultural fit, we've established there's enough in it for both parties to feel like they're getting equal value. That's all great, but if we don't actually follow through and work on the partnership and make sure we're constantly developing the relationships, ensuring that everyone's happy in that partnership, working together well, it won't sustain. It'll start off well, it'll peter away. And as I mentioned in one of the examples earlier I worked with, they can peter away to the point of surviving, but certainly not thriving. So those are the top 4 things. And obviously there's another factor I put on that questionnaire deliberately, which you did all rate fairly highly, which sits along or around all those 4 things, I think, and that's leadership, not surprisingly. In one of the examples I gave you earlier, that the leadership that created the ugly example was at fault throughout. It was really undermined the whole process by failing to recognise what was important. So leadership is really key, getting everybody aligned behind a common purpose. As the image suggests, pulling in the same direction. Very, very easy to say. As we all know, in large organisations, it's very hard to do. Even in small organisations, it's difficult to do. People have their own agendas. So unless the leaders of the partnership spend time and effort in ensuring everybody does understand, not just at a vision and values level what we're trying to achieve, but individually is bought into that, is engaged in that idea, committed to it, and happy to work on it for the sake of the partnership first, it won't work. You'll have one person pulling out of kilter and you won't be aligned. Success won't follow. So as a visual, I think that's what we're trying to achieve in partnership, whether there's 2 in the boat, 4 in the boat, 8 in the boat, or 2,000, as in one of the cases I worked on. Everybody has to realise they're in it for the same end and to be able to pull together. So that's the sort of, if you like, the ideal we're trying to head towards. So let's just have a quick view now of what the flip side of that is and what are the potential pitfalls and how to avoid them. So if we could at this point, Howard, share the second.
Sure. Okay, Abraham, let's get the second question up and let's put the answers. Okay. Lack of clear vision and strategy, no shared objectives, poor cultural fit, and weak leadership. Let's sum up the top 4 there, Jonathan.
That's great. And I think I'm really pleased to see that lack of clear vision and strategy comes out on top, because I think that often is the failure to dive into a partnership on the idea of a sort of an idea, if you like, a good idea that makes sense, but not really thinking through how they're going to achieve it. The strategy bit is really important. How are you going to achieve the success you want to achieve? So thank you for sharing that, Howard. And I'm pleased that this is working seamlessly at the moment. I may have spoke too soon. I shouldn't tempt fate, but the technology is working well. So thank you for that. So yes, as you can imagine, as always is the case in strengths and weaknesses or anything you look at in that sort of dynamic, the pitfalls are often the reverse of the strengths. So apologies as my screen sticks. The top 4 things identified as being the main strengths are naturally where the main causes of failure exist. And I just want to talk through these a little bit, just to give a sort of understanding of what we mean by those things. So you identify vision and strategy in the poll results there as being the top reason, and I think it is. And I think the strategy bit is about not just having that shared vision, as I mentioned, it's having a clear view of how we're going to make this partnership work, what are our objectives for the partnership, and then how are we going to actually identify whether we're making progress over a defined period of time. Having clear measurables in terms of both input, effort, and output and value are really important. Not just an end outcome, it's steps along the way and making sure that everyone is clear what they're going to do and then monitoring that progress, because as we all know, this is effectively managing change. It's not straightforward. But we'll come back to this at the bottom point, but just to mention that one of the key things in any of these environments is often not just define the failure to define a clear direction of travel, is the failure to see it through. So we must remember that it's always about setting a clear vision, clear strategy, agreed objectives, and seeing it through. So I talked a bit about poor cultural fit. Ultimately, it does come down to the people in a service organisation, particularly, obviously, if people can't work together in the partnership. If I worked with a rail company years ago, where 2 years into this new franchise, two businesses have been put together. People still wore the ties of the old rail companies. They still used the old mugs. They still felt aligned with their previous employer. And guess what? They worked against each other, even though they were part of the same organisation. So getting that commonality of view of values, exhibiting appropriate behaviour from the top down, making sure there's no mistrust in the organisation. Those are really important things. If you don't do that, it gnaws away at the organisation, the partnership, and undermines everything that it sets out to achieve. So whilst the vision's important, seeing it through is important, the underlying behaviours must always be checked, and wherever possible, measured, not just identified on a plaque in reception, actually measured and tested as to how we demonstrated the right behaviours. And equally, obviously, as we talked about equal value, if there is an inequality, if either partner feels they're putting in too much, not getting enough out, resentment will breed, they'll start to withdraw. In one of the cases I mentioned earlier, this happened to go in cycles where one partner felt at a particular time they were getting more out of it, put more in, then it dropped off, the other partner took the lead. They limped along, but really didn't succeed as a partnership. And I mentioned the last one, obviously above, seeing it through. Can't emphasize enough the need to have a plan that isn't just about getting this partnership off the ground. It's about seeing it through. What do we do when things go tough? What do we do in year 2 of this partnership? How do we keep getting past that initial excitement and making sure people are bought in, engaged, and are delivering the partnership outcomes we want to achieve? So as I say, no surprise, this is a reverse of the 4 strengths. But those things I don't think are any surprise. And yet again, they all come down to leadership. So having leaders who, at the start of the process, understand what's required to create a good partnership, really get a grasp of that and decide they're committed to doing it properly and seeing it through. If that's the case, you will have a good chance of achieving a successful partnership. If it's flavour of the month, something that's exciting, tactical opportunity, that we throw a lot of effort in and then with a big fanfare, we forget about a month later, it won't succeed. So I just want to finish off before we have a Q&A for the last 20 minutes of the session with a bit of a focus on supply chain partnerships, which I think is obviously particularly relevant to this sector, the construction sector, and something we've done a lot of work on in terms of working both client side and contractor side on partnerships with large supply chain client partners. And we've seen, again, as you can imagine, many different good, bad and ugly examples of partnerships with the same success and failure drivers as we mentioned before. So traditionally, and I'm sure you've all seen this won't be a surprise, this is probably teaching grandmother to suck eggs a bit, but I think it's important to stress this, that traditionally a lot of supply chain partnerships are top-down. And certainly in the sectors we've worked in, that has been the case. And in fact, what's happened in the last sort of cycles of lots of these sectors, particularly utilities, where we've done a lot of work up until recently, the cycle has been economic drivers have caused a squeeze further from the top. So a client needs to get more value either for its shareholders or for its regulator or its end users. It needs to improve service and or reduce cost. That drives a pressure on the supplier. If that pressure is driven top down on the supplier ends up obviously having to react, ends up having to then squeeze the level of service it provides to the end customer. And as no surprise, what happens is that end quality service starts to suffer. And often this happens cyclically. It will happen between contract periods and then within contracts where a client may feel in its first year or whatever cycle they're working to, they're not getting the results they want. They squeeze hard on the supplier and so on and so forth. That cycle, which is ultimately a race to the bottom, becomes worse. The next contract cycle, the margins are squeezed more. Somebody buys the work at a cheap price because they want to get into the market and they can't deliver the service because they haven't got the money to invest in the service. Downward the spiral goes. So I'm sure you've all seen that, and sadly, so have we over many years. I think there are some sectors that are now recognising that, and margins have got so tight for some suppliers that some clients and some regulators of those industries are recognising they need to change that dynamic, and are trying to do that. And there's the current cycles that are going in the water, gas, electricity sector as an example, are starting to try and put customer more at the heart of the commissioning model, and to ensure that the commissioning model is directed towards delivering better customer outcomes. But again, we're early stages of that particular cycle. So obviously the reverse of that, and the perspective that we would offer and suggest is the way forward for a successful client supply chain partnership, would be to flip that on its head, and that would be to take a bottom-up approach. And again, that's fairly obvious, I appreciate, but again, fairly rare. So we were working with a client supply chain partner relationship recently. I won't mention the sector because it'll be obvious, but in which a lot of effort was made by the client to talk about in the contractual negotiations around the tender, around the need to be collaborative. So I'm sure you've all come across collaborative behaviours assessments in tenders, and I'm sure you've come across elements of certain tenders where the weighting of those have got quite positive. In fact, I was working on one recently where there was a 30% of the overall weighting attached to collaborative behaviours. And collaborative behavioural assessments have become a big part of the assessment process. And at one level, that's fantastic. If in practice that's all talk and doesn't follow through, it's actually worse though, because what it does is raise an expectation of a level of behaviour that isn't then being adopted. And that integrity, say-do gap starts to undermine the delivery of the contract. So for a client to supply to in a situation, they can sit down and say, actually, as that example I gave you of the good contract I worked on, which was when they were in a difficult position, to sit down and work together, how they could really collaborate to deliver an improved service to the end customer. The customer at this point is what we call the unifying agenda. Let's forget the cost of the service for now, let's forget the margins. If we don't deliver the service to the end customer, we won't be in business for long. So getting that focus is a good way of taking it away from some of the more commercial challenges, shall we say, short-term challenges, and seeing how a client and supplier can sit together to work out the best ways of delivering a service. That requires trust, it requires openness, and requires obviously give and take on both sides. But it can be done, we've seen it done, and we've seen that when it is done, it achieves great results. So I hope that gives you something to take away in terms of supply chain partnerships in particular. But obviously, the key things I think to think alongside that are, whilst that's a mode of thinking, it's still the same success factors we're looking to achieve in terms of having a clear vision of what we're trying to achieve, having an aligned culture, particularly embedded behaviours, having a equality in terms of what we're trying to get out of it and put into it, and that commitment to see through the partnership and deliver the outcomes that all parties have signed up to. So I hope that is of use to you. I'm trying to leave enough time there, 20 minutes for Q&A. So Andrew, I think I'm handing back to you at this point.
Yeah, that's great, Jonathan. Thanks very much. Some good insights, some great case studies, and plenty to get the juices flowing, I think, for the Q&A session. So folks, if you have got any comments or questions you've got for Jonathan, please put them in the Slido Q&A box, and we'll come to them now. We've already got a couple. So question one, anonymous. Jonathan, do you think that a major issue not covered in your survey presentation is the low level of trust in the construction sector, particularly in the supply chain? Good one to start.
I think trust is a key issue. I mean, I wasn't trying to be specific about sectors, but I think what I'm wondering about that question is whether that's actually trust of the supply chain or within the supply chain. So if I take both in turn, from my experiences of working with supply chain partnerships, the level of trust from the client, shall we say, is often the biggest challenge, I think, in that the client can get into a mindset of perpetually thinking the supply chain aren't delivering, therefore I'll shout louder, I'll bang the table harder, I'll ask for more. And inevitably the supply chain will think that the client doesn't understand what we're trying to do, and they're not treating us the right way, and that trust cycle is broken. What we have seen is the recognition of that in some areas, probably less so in the construction sector. I think that's fair to say. But having said that, I think there are, if you look at the work going around the HS2 area in particular moment, there are some new innovative collaborative partnerships there, looking at long-term projects that I think are trying to set out and address partnership working on and supply chain working on a more proactive footing.
Yeah, I think, Jonathan, I mean, we've just been judging the CE Midlands Awards in the East and the West, and we're seeing some pockets of absolute brilliance in terms of collaborative working and integrating the supply chain. The problem is, I think the rump of the industry is still very adversarial and very fragmented, and there's a lack of trust at every interface. There's always man marking at every interface of the supply chain. And that's down to lack of trust. Now, there may be good reason for that lack of trust. As you say, it might be down to lack of performance. But I think that trust word should be there with a capital T, because for me, it's been the main obstacle of us trying to achieve this collaborative partnership arrangement for the last 23 years, to be honest.
I think I think the way I see trust is an outcome. So trust is an outcome of doing things either well or not. So you can obviously, there's a degree of which trust is assumed and trust is earned. So I think where we've seen in supply chain partnerships, we've seen trust be at low levels, as the question asks, is where there's been that history of that cycle, that downward cycle of client and supplier not really working together and not squeezing.
Some of the findings of the building safety review following Dame Judith Hackett's report after Grenfell, some of the things that have come out of that inquiry don't actually give us too much confidence in trust when you look at the performance of some of the supply chain and what they've done. So I think we've got a mountain to climb, Jonathan, still. But
I think so. I think the one thing I would say about breaking the trust cycle, Andrew, is that and I was working with a client recently. We had a supplier day. We got all their suppliers and potential suppliers together in a room with the client and talked about what the client wanted to do and recognizing some of those issues. It takes a degree of leadership and honesty and openness to say, actually, I think we've got this wrong. I was talking to a client recently who's come into a client organization in this sector in construction, who recognized that and said, how can I break that cycle? In that case, I think the client, it's incumbent on the client in a supply chain relationship to be open and honest to that. Let's recognize we haven't got great trust here.
Yeah, well, openness and honesty is always one of the things that spews out, isn't it, when you do these post-it notes in terms of what's necessary. Let's go on to the next question. So leadership is crucial to modeling collaborative behaviors and working. Is the problem in the sector poor, outdated leaders who need to give way to new leaders? There's an interesting one, Jonathan.
Simple response to that would be, I'd say yes, because I do think there are, if you look at, and I include myself in this generation, there are a lot of people in sort of senior roles who learned and grown up in one way of working. They've learned in a hierarchical top-down environment, and there's almost bravado in particularly supply chain relationships. You might see them around giving the supplier a kicking. So yes, I think there is at one level, if a younger generation of leaders who are more open and more collaborative by nature come through, that is great. And in looking at some of the work we've done around, we're involved in a movement called Engage for Success around employee engagement. There's been quite a challenge around this, and people saying it's really difficult to change leaders. Have you got to look to the future and accept what it is for now? But I'm an eternal optimist, and I think there are leaders who, even though they are relatively ingrained in ways of working, will change if people challenge them and push them to change.
I have to say, Jonathan, as somebody who is male, stale and pale, I'm sometimes offended by the thought process that it's older folks that are not willing to change.
Yes.
Because, I'm in my 60s and I've been looking at change for 2 decades or more. And there are people far younger than me that have not got that change attitude. So I'm not sure it's an age thing. I think it's a state of mind is my personal view. But I think generally what you're saying is accurate. We've got more questions.
Andrew, if we just mentioned on that, being part of that group, I agree. But I think the thing we've done some research on this as Engage for Success. They found out that basically only 1 in 4 of senior leaders have the attitude required to be truly open and engaging and collaborative. So unfortunately.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying, Jonathan, but I don't think we should tar everyone with the same brush.
Totally. Yeah.
So next question from Richard. Richard chairs our quality and compliance group in the Southwest. He's asking, what are the indicators that a partnership has run its course?
I think there are several. That's a good question, Richard. I think one of the examples I gave earlier was a partnership that was contracted for 23 years. I could tell you to run its course within 2 or 3. Obviously, contractually had to continue, but I think the key indicators are if you were looking at the behaviours of people, and particularly silo working, if them and us culture has started to become ingrained, very hard to turn around. That doesn't mean obviously it can't be rescued, but if it hasn't been identified and addressed, it will just seep into the organisation and create negativity that will undermine everything you try to do. So when you start to get that people wearing their respective hats, badges, ties, sticking into their little teams, working in silos, not collaborating actively, and the them and us thing exists, I think that's the key indicator.
So can I put sort of an addendum question to that? Because one of the benefits to me of working in partnership is actually, going from one job to the next to get continuous improvement. And I remember my first involvement in something similar was with the MOD when we were looking at a 10-year program, the SLAM program, Single Living Accommodation Modernization. And we had a 5% target year-on-year savings to make through collaborative working, partnerships, and then finding savings and removing waste without adversely affecting our profit. And that's where I saw it work for the first time. So I thought my understanding of a partnering arrangement is that actually the longer it goes on, the better it should get and the more waste you remove from the process. Is that your understanding?
Absolutely. I think partnerships take time to become truly effective. So we all know it takes 2 or 3 years to change culture. So to create a new culture is equally similar. You can damage culture overnight, but to build a healthy culture takes time. Okay. So I think we need to constantly work at it. And I mentioned earlier about what are the 4 drivers there. Seeing it through, commitment to see it through and keep improving, keep investing in the relationships is absolutely essential. Okay.
Abraham, let's go to the next question, if we may, please. So how vulnerable are partnerships in a recession? That's a good question.
It is. I mean, you saw the stats I mentioned earlier, that the Harvard Business Review comment about they've identified that actually more partnerships tend to form in a recession as a way of particularly accelerating recovery. So existing partnerships going into recession can obviously be vulnerable. But again, the idea of a partnership obviously is that you have mutual protection, mutual risk, sharing of risk. So in theory, a partnership can be more protected in a recession than 2 individual organisations. But certainly in terms of recovery from a recession, you're in a position where you can benefit from leveraging each other's skill base, capacity, etc., markets, rather than just trying to grow organically. So I think I wouldn't say partnerships are any more vulnerable in a recession than an existing organisation, but they have the potential to be a real boost and a bonus in coming out of recession.
I think in theory, Jonathan, what you say is absolutely correct. But in the construction industry, I'm sure those on the call will support me. A lot of partnerships hit the dust as soon as the recession came because clients saw they could go to the market and get cheaper systems and products, which actually in the long run is probably a reason we've got the industry we've got. But that's me being cynical. Let's move to the next question. Next question. So supply chain partnerships are quite often unequal, especially when based on cheapest win selection. Poor procurement results in poor unbalanced partnerships. Yes. I'm not sure whether that's a question or a statement, but
I think it's a very good statement. I think a lot of the work we're doing at the moment in the rail sector is talking to the commissioning bodies, and I won't mention who, but talking to the commissioning bodies about how they could take some of these principles and start to commission businesses and partnerships better, but particularly for the clients to work more collaboratively in partnership with their supply chain. And I think one of the examples I gave earlier, where the sort of bad example I gave, where a client and supply chain partnership talk at a service level about being equal and working together, but don't do that. That's worse. That integrity issue is massive. It undermines it because the staff, going back to the previous question, see what's going on and have a lack of trust. So I think absolutely getting on the right footing in the first place, getting procurement that's driven by and has measures of success for the partnership in place from day one and commitments to honour that, absolutely essential.
I'm going to bring in a question that's actually appeared in the chat box, Jonathan, if I may.
Yes.
Linda says, I'm curious how money fits into the effective partnership. If one is paying the other money or no money is exchanged, what does that mean to the relationship? Forgive me, says Linda, I might have missed this if you referred to it in the presentation.
Well, Linda, thank you for the question. I didn't mention money specifically, other than I talked about equal value. So, and obviously value in terms of both inputs, outputs from the partnership, and also the ultimate value that's achieved. But obviously, which within is their largely financial impact in terms of investment, cost, and return. I think if there's an inequality, it's always a problem. And where people will tell you it's not a problem, I think it is. It always brews. And naturally, most partners won't be equal in what they put into the partnership or take out of it. So I think where that's not the case, the key is to make sure that's addressed, identified up front, and equalised by some other measure.
Okay, thank you. And Howard has asked a question. He's our colleague from Leaders Meets. Leadership mindset, the externalization of a leader's beliefs and attitude, is not age related, he says. How can the sector change outdated leaders with poor beliefs?
That's the $6 million question, isn't it? As I said, that the engagement success movement has gone down the road of training and educating leaders, but particularly focusing on next generation. So they have given up somewhat on those of us who are white, male, pale and stale. But having said that, I think that is, you're right, Andrew, that's a major generalisation. It is about attitudes. The survey I mentioned earlier, where we identified that only 1 in 4 leaders had the right attitudes, as it were, and that was a survey done by an independent research body, tells you that there's a challenge there, but it doesn't mean it's an impossible challenge. I think the best thing that we can do in addressing this is to ultimately share good practice, talk up good stories. And I think in terms of supply chain relationships, what I was going to say, I forgot to say earlier, was that I think that it's incumbent on the supplier not just to receive what it gets from the client. It's incumbent on the supplier to identify where there are things that may not be helping it give its best, and to be open to change and to lead from the bottom, as it were, inverted commas, not to wait for that change to come from the top. Yep. Every client I've worked with for 30 years, the issue has been leadership from the top. If you wait for them to look in the mirror and change themselves, you're going to wait a hell of a long time. So I think it's incumbent on all of us to challenge people and hold the mirror up to them and explain why those behaviours aren't helping and how the changing attitude could help.
Well, certainly the role of constructing excellence is to showcase best practice and put forward case studies of where excellence has worked. We've got no more questions. One person I forgot to give a shout out to earlier was Helena Knight, so apologies for that from Bracknell. Thank you for joining us today. We've now got a feedback survey, which we're going to ask you to take, please. Again, if you go to slido.com, hashtag LM180621, that's where you can fill in the feedback survey, which is very helpful to us in establishing what you like, what you don't like, what we can improve, what you want to see in the future, and so on. So please take just 30 seconds. That's all it takes to fill in that. And we've also now got Abraham a slide, hopefully coming up with the details of our CPD certificate, which we now make available. If you go to, there we go, www.mypropass.co.uk and type in CE#629, that will give you a CPD certificate for what you've heard during this hour-long webinar. Lots of people have been asking for CPD certificates, so that's now something we can offer you. Something else I'd like to promote, and I've put in the chat box, we've been talking about how effective partnerships can work and how it can help you. One of the main obstacles, as I've mentioned in the last 20 plus years in construction, is that we've known what to do and why we should do it, but we've suffered in the how. We just haven't been able to get it across the line. So Constructing Excellence has now got a diploma in collaboration in construction. I've put a link in the chat box. We're doing our first course starting in September this year. We've got, I think, room for another 4 delegates, if I'm correct. So we've got 4 more places available. It's a year-long diploma course, 1 morning a month online with homework and additional reading that you'll need to do. But that diploma that will then give you a level 5 accreditation in collaborative working in construction, and something that you may find useful when promoting your business, your wares, so to speak, to future clients, because we're seeing more and more that clients are now requiring a collaborative approach. And that's been driven certainly in recent years by the Hackett Review, who mentions it pretty much on every page. So please do have a look at that diploma in collaboration in construction. The details are in the chat box. Now then, Abraham, let me have a look at the next slide, which I think is going to tell us all about next week. So there can be no doubt that the #1 issue across the UK, not just in construction, but around the world, is the net zero agenda. You're probably aware that the Construction Leadership Council have now set up a Construct Zero board. I'm delighted to say that I now sit on that, and I'm actually heading a subgroup within the board looking at the milestones and metrics for construction. We've split the board into 3, one dealing with transportation, one dealing at buildings, and one dealing with construction activity. And I'm chairing the construction activity group, and we're working on some feedback to deliver metrics and milestones about mid-July, I think. But next week I've got the overall chair of our group coming along from ACE, Hannah Vickers. She sits on the Construction Leadership Council. So next week will be very interesting, I hope you'll find. And we're certainly looking to push companies to become what we're calling net zero champions. So that's next week, same time.
Andrew?
Yes.
Can I do a plug?
Yes.
Yeah, the Somerset Club are having a discussion at 5:15 for an hour on the issue of trust in the construction sector. And we have Amanda Young, who was with us a couple of weeks ago, and a lawyer, Sarah Fox, joining us to talk about the issues of trust in the construction sector.
Okay, thank you. And that's today, is it?
No, that's next week, next Thursday at 5:15, the 24th.
Right, okay.
I'll see if we can put it in the chat pane if we've got a link for it.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay, no problem. What I'd like to do now, we're almost running out of time. Thank Howard and thank Abraham from Leaders Meets, as always, for hosting these excellent webinars. But most importantly, to thank Jonathan for giving him his time and his expertise to be with us. Jonathan, thank you so much. We really appreciate what you had to say, some really useful nuggets for us to take away. Right now, it's fast approaching 1 o'clock. Time for me, Andrew, to say, I nearly said my DJ name then. I nearly went back in time. I've got a DJ name called Andrew St. John. I was on a flow then. I thought I was back in the nightclubs. I've done nightclub DJing for about 14 years. So forgive me. I've gone red now as well, you can see. So thank you all for attending, and we'll see you next week for Net Zero. Have a great weekend. Cheers. Bye.